Today is a day I didn't have anything prepared for catechism. But what I wanted to do is give a commentary, which is kind of like a catechism, but it's a commentary on the event in the life of King David when he went up against Goliath, right? Because it's a wonderful. I've given it a couple times, so a few of you have heard it through the third order talk. I gave it once to the children in our Marian Seraphic Youth. But it is a wonderful reading through this. You know, we grow up thinking that the story, quote unquote, the story of David and Goliath is it's just a cute, interesting thing that, you know, and you see little children's books always made about David and Goliath and all this kind of stuff. But when you actually read through it, you see it's a perfect catechism on what we've been talking about, fear, and how to face fear. Especially when we're dealing with those of us who have the sacraments, so the Christians, the chosen people of God, and how we're to face going up against the things in this world. And when we focus on the things of this world, the natural stuff, as we've been talking about, we easily get intimidated. Or we get so consumed by it that it just keeps bringing up inside of us all these echoes of difficulty and pain and frustration and sorrow that we're getting ready to face. And so that makes us anxious. It makes us worried. We don't want to have to face it. We don't know if we'll face it properly. And then we start focusing only on that. I forgot to mention it yesterday, and I mentioned it down here before. But remember, there's in the life of Saint Anthony of the Desert, and I can't find this quote. So if anybody can find it, let me know. But I can't find the quote. But I'm sure that it's a real quote. And if not, it makes sense and sums up kind of the life of Saint Anthony of the Desert, anyways. But one day when he got to the brow of the town, from the desert to Alexandria. Remember Alexandria? He was in the desert outside of Alexandria. And when he got to the brow of that town, he found this is St. Anthony, who'd done all the battle out in the desert against demons, right? They're constantly tempting him, and he fought against them to the point where on one occasion, they were attacked. They were allowed to actually attack him, and all kinds of things were happening. Well, he was found on the floor of his hermitage, this little cave, basically dead, but he was still alive. And so the person scooped him up, because people would bring him bread every once in a while, and they found him basically, it looked like he was dead. So they took him to a hospital, whatever that meant back then, and they took him to a hospital, and when he regained consciousness, he's like, "Where am I? We have you at the hospital here, maybe Alexandria or something." He said, "Take me back." He couldn't walk, he could barely move, he just knew from being attacked by the demons, he couldn't flee, he had to go back. So he had him take him back to the cave, and they just lay me on the ground. And they laid him on the ground because he couldn't do anything yet. And he just cried out, "Anthony's back," just to let him know, like, "You're not scaring me off. I'm here. Kill me if you want. I'm not leaving." And so he did such damage because humility and constancy, these are virtues that the demons can't take. They can't take this from us because we're weak. We're weak and they're strong. And when we crush them in our weakness, it's a tremendous humiliation. This is why God allows it. He allows us to be weak and be able to crush them with His grace. But when he got to the edge of that town in Alexandria, he saw this little demon just sitting on a rock playing a flute. And, you know, big, strong Anthony now, because he'd just been through all this, he's not afraid of a little demon. He's seen the worst, as you can see. He just says, "What are you doing?" And the demon's like, For you monks, for you hermits out there in the woods, it takes legions of us demons to be able to tempt you and to put fear into your hearts. But for all the people down in that little town, I just need this little flute. And that's what you see today, like through the media. You see all the apps, those phones. You see people going around just staring at the phone. Give them their phone, give them their app, let it make lights and bells and do all kinds of stuff, and they will follow it anywhere. And I've been able to tell from doing this, when we started our third order, we made it's not illegal, but we're trying to get people away from their phones. And they'll cry out, and they just say, "You're a Luddite." I was like, "What's a Luddite?" Has anybody ever heard the word Luddite? It means somebody who hates, like, what is it? It hates technology and stuff. A Luddite. Luddite. I can't keep up. So just because you don't, you got this thing, but the thing is when you're addicted to something, you will cry out. And you'll accuse whoever's telling you what you're doing is wrong. You'll go after them. And now you tell people, like, hey, you shouldn't be on the media. They get mad because that's all they do. Hey, you shouldn't be using your phone all the time. They get mad because they're only using it for holy things. I listen to religious talks from the time I wake up to the time I go to bed. Yeah, you think that's a good thing? You're not supposed to be listening to stuff all day long. Give me a break. The Desert Fathers, they went out into the silence. They didn't just go listen to people talk to them all day long. So we need to learn how to face our fears. And in doing that, I just wanted to give this commentary. So we're going to read through. It's from, I didn't write down the quote. But anyways, whatever that is in Kings where David goes and beats up a big giant. For Israel had put themselves in array, and the Philistines who stood against them were prepared. Now remember, they already had king. They had the King Saul. And all of Israel, God's army, is there on the battlefield in front of the Philistines. And the Philistines basically were getting ready to make mincemeat out of the Israelites because the Israelites were scared to death. And this is what we see. And David was off taking care of his sheep. Now, he was already working for the king in some capacity, play the flute and stuff. You'll see that. And then he had to go off and take care of his dad's sheep again, probably because the other boys had to go fight in this war. Well, David's making his way back in. So David, leaving his vessels, which he had brought, under the care of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the place of the battle and asked if all went well with his brethren, because his brothers were there fighting in that battle, or getting ready to fight in that battle. He wanted to check on his brothers, act of charity. And as he talked to them, that base-born man, now this base-born man, a low man, this is what the Goliath, he was a base-born man. Now what we're going to compare the Goliath to in this story, obviously, not story, you know what I mean, but Goliath to is the things of the world, base-born. That's what we mean. You've got the two camps. Remember last night we talked about the natural and the supernatural. You've got the two masters. Here you're dealing with the natural, Goliath, and the supernatural, the army of God, who's represented by David in this. So then that base-born man whose name was Goliath, the Philistine of Gath, showed himself coming up from the camp of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words, and David heard them. And all the Israelites then saw them. When they saw the man, they fled from his face, fearing him exceedingly. And someone of Israel said, "Have you seen this man that is coming up? For he is coming up to defy Israel. And the man who shall slay him, the king will enrich with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and will make his father's house free from tribute to Israel." Now Goliath basically had proposed a challenge. If anyone will come out against him, it would end the war. It would end the battle right there. If they could beat Goliath, it would end the battle. And nobody would do it because Goliath was this giant of a man. He was a giant warrior. And David spoke to the men that stood by. Now, David was a skinny young man that took care of sheep. He was still they called him Rudy. We'll get to it. But he's a ruddy young man, probably looked pretty, just like a little guy. And David spoke to the men that stood by him, saying, "What shall be given to the man that shall kill this Philistine?" And he had just heard it. Now he's asking it again. He just heard it. "And shall take away the reproach of Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, this ungodly, base-born, natural man that doesn't have the dignity of a son of God and doesn't want it, that should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in the same words, saying the things that they had said before, whoever slays him. Now when Eliab, his older brother, heard this, when he was speaking with the others, he was angry. His brother got angry with him. And he said, "Why camest thou hither? And why did thou leave those few sheep in the desert?" He's accusing him. Now David is starting to get indignant. You just noticed it. He's been told what the baseborn man said, and now he keeps asking, what did he say? What did he say? He knows what he said, but he keeps asking it again and again. He's becoming more and more indignant that this man would dare say something like that. Now his brother comes up to accuse him. You're just neglecting your duties. You just left those couple of sheep you're supposed to be taking care of. You can't even do that right. "I know thy pride," his brother said to him, "and the wickedness of thy heart, that thou art come down to see the battle," curiosity. See that? He just thinks his brother's just being curious. You just want to see a fight. You're bored out there taking care of the sheep, and you want to come down here and see what men do. But one of the things we can take away from this is in our daily battle, with all the nonsense that's being pushed up against us today, whether in the church or outside the church, especially with all this propaganda that we get every day in the news about COVID and vaccines and whatever else, things that we don't see really around us. We know the sickness is around us, but we don't really, you see that they're promoting fear. And those people who don't get on board with it, like we talked about in the first day, they terrorize you. If you don't fall into their maxim, then they terrorize you. But even when they accuse us, and they make a good accusation against us, they try to make us look evil and try to destroy our character. The accusation, what does it mean? If it's not true. See, we allow ourselves to get broken and bent over by what other people think of us, but it only matters what's true, even if only God knows what's true, right? These are things we have to constantly be reminding ourselves of, because we face this all the time, and you're going to face it now with choices that you have to make. So now he's accused of negligence and of curiosity. And David said, "What have I done? Is there not cause to speak?" You got this giant defying God. He's defying God. And he sees him as a giant. He sees him as a giant. But before God, what's a giant? What's a giant for the army of God? Have they not already worked huge miracles being the army of God? Yeah, they go, just before this, not too long before this, you've got other judges where God sent away the whole army. Remember Gideon? Sent away the whole army. And he goes through this whole thing, like have them drink water. Whoever lapped up, send them home. Whoever didn't, they were going to fight for me, and then send more home. And in the end, it's like 300 against who knows what it was. And the army of God just wipes everybody out. Thing is trust in God. It's trust in God that wipes out the army, not the strength of men. And David, having faith, especially because he's young, the young people tend to have the faith. Do you see? We even see it today in the church. How do we treat young people? We provide rock concerts for them, and we say that they're Catholic. This is how we deal with kids. And then when they get older, we think it's weird that they don't want to go to church anymore, because they never take it seriously anyways. But we find when you talk to kids and you talk to them about the truth, just like I'm talking to you right now, they sit up in their seat, just like a lot of you are, and they listen. Kids, they love it. They love it when adults talk to them and don't tell them lies. They love it when adults take them seriously, because they have the capacity to understand it, right? And we don't believe it. We treat them like, I don't know. We lower ourselves to a place below where they're at, thinking that we'll somehow entertain and appease them. Completely wrong. So a young man, David's a young man, and he has a keen sense of what's going on. What have I done? Is there not cause to speak? And then he turned aside from his brother. That's exactly right. He doesn't have to sit there and defend himself. He just asked a question, and he turned away and kept going. And what did he do when he turned away? He said the same word. The same word, meaning he turned to the people, and he asked the people as before. What did he say? What did he say? He's going to defy God? What did he say? He's just going around asking people this, right? He didn't get discouraged by his brother, but he followed the inspiration, his conscience. His conscience was pricked. This is wrong. What he's doing is wrong. And there's a whole army here, and nobody's standing up to this. Somebody has to stand up to this. God's honor must be defended. Somebody must stand up, and nobody would do it. The whole army, they're all cowering. I don't know. The king said that he'll give him like his daughter's a wife, and he'll give him all this stuff. He doesn't have to pay tribute anymore. Nobody cares. I'm not going up against that guy, right? They're not thinking about the supernatural. David's indignant because he offended God. And the words which David spoke were heard and were rehearsed before Saul. They were rehearsed. He just kept saying the same thing over and over. And then finally he got to Saul, the king, and he said the exact same thing. And when he was brought to him, that is Saul, he said to him, "Let not any man's heart be dismayed in him. I, thy servant, will go." Me, a young kid, I'm going to do it. I, thy servant, so the generosity you see in David. I, thy servant, will go, and I will fight against the Philistine. And Saul said to David, "Thou art not able to withstand the Philistine, nor to fight against him, for thou art but a boy, and he's a warrior from his youth." And David said to Saul, and here's our lesson. David said to Saul, "Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear." Now remember I told you about the lion? A lion's not always in Scripture a sign of our Lord. And this is what we do now. We put these pictures up of lions, and we think that somehow, because Protestants do it. Protestants started doing that. It's all this heroic lion stuff, right? Well, the lion lots of the time is a bad thing. So you got the lion and the bear, which here we could even say represents vice. A lion or a bear, they came and took a ram out of the midst of the flock. And here it is. "And I pursued after them and struck them and delivered them out of the mouth. And they rose." So he said "or," but it happened twice. "And they rose up against me." And what did he do? "I caught them by the throat, and I strangled and killed them." What would you do? Man, they just took off with the sheep. Whew, that was a close one. Instead, he chased them down. He freed the rams. And then when they rose up against him, he strangled them to death. He fought them. He didn't turn, high heel, and run. He saved the ram. He attacked his assailant. He attacked the temptation. He went after the vice. He rooted it out and he destroyed it. Though it was bigger than him, though it was stronger than him, he didn't flinch a bit. That means he had zero fear about his own life, zero thought of his own life, but he did his duty. These are the lessons. This isn't a childhood story. These are lessons for us that we have so many beautiful things that we need to take and actually implement into our lives. How do we act when the vices come? How do we act when the temptation comes? How do we act when the fear comes? So now David already has a history of standing up for things, chasing things down, and killing them, right? That is the evil that comes after us. He chased down fear, he faced his fear, he caught it, and he overcame it. And then he killed it. "For I, thy servant, have killed both lion and a bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be also as one of them. I will go now, and I will take away the reproach of Israel." Remember, young people, they get these bold ideas. When we get older, we mock them for it. Because they know it's right, and they know their life's worth dying for something important. The older we get, we don't think that way, do we? We think about preserving our life at almost every cost. making sure we can still go on vacation, making sure we can still have the things that we want to have, do the things that we want to do. Just compromise a little bit. It won't matter. Just you'll get over it. Young people don't think that way. It's all or nothing. Right now, this is wrong, and I'm going to do something about it. That's a good thing. And then we all need to keep that, especially for our faith and for to take away the reproach of God, which is everywhere today. And who does anything about it? The whole army of God stays silent when the reproach comes against God. Now it even comes from the hierarchy, often. And what do? Nothing. We don't do anything. I will go now and take away the reproach of the people. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine who hath dared to curse the army of God? And David said, the Lord who delivered me, faith, the Lord who delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. And if he doesn't, blessed be God forever. God's the author of life and death. We have to do what we have to do. He decides when we die. He decides how we die, right? Our job is to do our duty and leave it to God on what happens after that. And Saul said to David, go. It's like, he's determined, go, fine, go. And the Lord be with thee. And Saul clothed David with his garments and put on his helmet of brass, the brass on his head, and armed him with a coat of mail. And David, having girded himself with a sword upon his armor, began to try if he could walk in armor, for he was not accustomed to it. And David said to Saul, I cannot go thus, for I am not used to it. And he laid them off. So he took off the armor, he took off the helmet, he took off all the protective stuff, even the weapon. He even took off the weapon. If you have God, if you really believe you're serving God, you don't have to worry about a big sword. He took off, I cannot go thus, and he laid it off. And what did he take? He took his staff, and it says this, which he always had in his hand. What's that? Habitual grace, virtue, things we should always have in hand. These are the weapons that we take. He just took what he always has. He didn't try to rely on something else that was foreign or new or whatever. He took that thing he'd built up inside of him, right? The staff is a sign of habitual grace. The staff is a sign of virtue. You cling to and it assists you, right? He took it up in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones out of the brook. Now, stones out of a brook, the reason they're smooth is because they get everything worked off of them, right? That's what virtue does. You don't get a virtue unless you chisel away at your faults. This is what he picks up 5 of these. You could say 5 virtues. They symbolize and also 5 we could put as the wounds. Wounds are the difficulties in acquiring virtue, and he takes 5 of these in hand out of the brook, that is the water of grace, and he put them into the shepherd's script. Script was a little pouch that kept money, and even pilgrims would continue to wear the script was part of there. It was just like a little pouch there. It was like a little bag that they wore around, script, which he had with them, and he took a sling in his hand and went forth against the Philistine. Got a whole army there scared to death. You got a giant there with a sword and an armor and a huge shield, probably bigger than David, just the shield. And David takes his staff and picks up 5 stones. And the Philistine came on and drew nigh against David and his armor bearer before him. And when the Philistine looked and beheld David, he despised him, for he was a young man, ruddy and comely of countenance. And the Philistine said of David, Am I a dog? Am I a dog that thou come out against me with a staff? He's offended. You're sending a kid with a stick? You're sending a kid with a stick against me? I'm like the best guy in the army, and you're sending a kid with a stick? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And he said to David, "Come to me, and I will give thy flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the earth." You know, that'd probably make us tremble. But David was indignant. He was indignant for the glory of God. And David said to the Philistine, "Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, and I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the army of Israel, which thou hast defied." Indignant. Indignant. That's holy righteousness. It's the same righteousness that sent our Lord into the temple and started whipping everybody. What David is saying is, by his sin, by the sin of this base-born man, he's got to pay. Remember we talked about it last night? Sin's not freedom. Going against God's not freedom. They always have to pay. There's always a consequence. And now David's saying, I'm going to take your life. You're going to pay. This day, and the Lord will deliver thee into my hands. I will slay thee and take away thy head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the army of the Philistines. He's not just talking about, he said he's going to wipe out the whole army, this kid with a stick. He's going to wipe out the whole army of the Philistines. The whole army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the earth. And all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. See the point of practicing virtue, facing down fears, being indignant when people offend God? We have to prove that there is a God that is the head of our army. There's a reason why we go to the Holy Catholic Roman Church. We have to stand up for what we actually believe and not just keep getting beaten down by everything around us. And all this assembly shall know, that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for it is his battle, and he will deliver you into my hands. Virtue is the thing. Eliminating vice and increasing our virtue, it's holiness which will always conquer the enemy. And that's what will show the world that our God, the God of Israel, is the true God. It's through virtue. And when the Philistines arose, and when the Philistine arose and was coming and drew nigh to meet David, what did David do? You can imagine your heart would be beating out of your chest. You got a stick in your hand, and you're walking out in this field. The whole army of Israel is behind you, and you're a kid. You were just taking care of sheep yesterday, and you're on a journey today. Now you're there with a stick in your hand, and because you open your mouth, you're standing in front of this giant, and you got to go forward. That army's over there. There's this big giant in front of you. Your army's behind you with the king, and you're sitting there with a stick in your hand. Put yourself in place. His heart must have been, but what did he do? David made haste and ran to the fight to meet the Philistine. He ran at him. He had a stick and 5 rocks, and he just started running at the guy. And he put his hand into the script, took a stone, and cast it with the sling. And fetching it about, struck the Philistine in the forehead, and the stone was fixed in his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. And David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. And he struck and slew the Philistine, as David had no sword in his hand. He ran and stood over the Philistine and took the Philistine's sword, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and slew him, cutting off his head. Right? We have to separate. You have to absolutely separate ourselves from sin, destroy it utterly, outright, have a hatred for it. The base-born, natural stuff that we fix our attention on that brings so much turmoil into our lives, you've got to sever it. You have to sever it. When you find it's an actual problem, you have to sever it. People use those phones and they start to use it for bad things. And then they come and they say, hey, I got a problem doing this bad stuff whenever I use this phone. You know what you got to do? You got to destroy your phone. I talked to a father the other day and his boy was using the computer for bad things. What did the dad do? He destroyed the computer right there. He picked it up and destroyed it. And I was like, well, it wasn't good that you lost your temper, but it was wonderful that you destroyed the computer right in front of your son. And that's what he needs to see. You need to be calm and destroy the computer. And the men of Israel, now everybody took heart, right? I'm sorry, wait, I'm going to do it. And the Philistines, seeing that their champion was defeated, they fled. The world is that way. It's so strong. And like we were talking about last night, it cries out, it makes you, it insists that you give it all of your attention. It's jealous, just like our Lord's jealous for us. The world is very jealous for our attention. And when it doesn't get it, it tries to destroy you. And the more you pay attention to it, you actually start to you get scared to death of what's going to happen to you. If you don't get the vaccine, you can't go on vacation. If you don't get the vaccine, you can't go visit your children anymore. If you don't get the vaccine, they just keep saying it over and over and over again. And then even when you get it, they won't let you do anything. You see? All the men of Israel, so the point here is when we stand up, we fight the giants because we're indignant that they've offended our dear Lord. When we sever their heads by our constancy, the enemy will fly. But here's the great consequence, more than them just flying, because even if they don't fly, here's the consequence. And the men of Israel, now when we say Israel, we mean the church of God. And the men of Israel and Judah, raising up, shouted and pursued after the Philistines till they came to the valley and the gate of Acharon. Why doesn't anybody do anything today? Because no one will stand up. There's no battles that are won. We just get beaten down more and more, and everybody just submits. We don't fight any battles. We don't stand up. At Rome, they come out and say something that's absolutely horrendous and offensive, and we don't do anything. They bring in idols into our churches, and we say nothing. They put pots of soil that are considered divine on the altar during the sacrifice of the Mass, and we ignore it. We get told that the people that are divorced, remarried, not only can live in sin and receive the Eucharist, but they should continue to sin because it's good for the children. We get that in papal documents. Really? And we just stand there and say, what are we supposed to do? I can't even remember all the instances, so I'm not going to say more. There's just so many. Let alone all the things we have to deal with in our government, in our society. And there fell many wounded of the Philistines in the way of Saraim, and as far as Gath, and as far as Acharon. And the children of Israel returned after they had pursued the Philistine. They fell upon their camp, and David took the head of the Philistine, brought it to Jerusalem. But his armor-bearer put it in his tent. Keeping the head is a sign of the victory. It's a sign of the enemy. It's keeping before your eyes the problems that we face, not forgetting. Our memory, we tend to forget. We have to continue to fight. You have to keep remembering what's there, not lose heart. What happens is when we make it over one thing, we celebrate, and then we get attacked again, and it gets worse. We have to stay constant in the virtue of God. We have to be constant and ever vigilant, right? Because like Scripture says, the lion is always prowling and roaring, looking for somebody to consume. As soon as we're off guard for a moment, that's when it happens. We have to be constant and vigilant in virtue and in our service of God. Now at the time that Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the captain of the army, "Of what family is this young man, a descendant?" And Abner said, "As thy soul liveth, O king, I know not." This is the whole point. When we stand up and do what we ought to do, when we do our duty as Christians, when we live the virtue we ought to live, when we give the good example that we ought to give, and we don't bend on things that we ought not bend on, they ask, what family are they from? He's a Catholic. She's a Catholic. They go to Mass every day. That one prays the rosary all the time. It's a Catholic. They're a believer. And the king said, inquire thou, whose son this man is. And when David was returning after the Philistine was slain, Abner took him and brought him in before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hands, a symbol of the victory and a warning against future dangers. And Saul said to him, young man, of what family art thou? And David said, I am the son of thy servant Asai, the Bethlehemite. Thus ends the historical account of the battle between Goliath and David. I have a couple of notes here. The bear and the lion are symbols of danger in this world that want to rob us of our purity. Hence, they took away the flocks, which means here we have the offensive approach rather than the defensive. Meaning, when we see something coming after our virtue, just like David, you don't just keep trying to figure out a way around it. You do like David, and you just run after the thing. You run after it and you kill it. You cut its head off. You destroy the thing. But we don't do that. The reason we keep getting beat down is we're always on the defensive. We have to be on the offensive. If we see something in our life that could be a problem, you eliminate the thing. You eliminate it. You don't wait till the phone becomes a problem. You stop using those kind of phones and you get a phone that's not a problem. When we see everybody has a certain problem with something, you don't start doing that thing. Some children are very immune to it. They realize that, certain people, they see the other kids around them, they do certain kinds of drugs, and they know the problems they bring on those kids, so those kids won't ever touch this stuff or be around people that do it, because they know, well, if I do what they're doing, I'll fall into it. So they take the offensive instead of the defensive. They just completely take a different path on avoiding the whole thing, right? Offensive approach in pursuing a different course that will eliminate all of the other things. The sling and the stone, it's holy simplicity. The sling and the stone's simple, it's holy simplicity, and that's what we need. We don't need to be big, sophisticated people that know how to do all kinds of stuff. When people are speaking to you in a very foul way or whatever, when there's a Christian who just puts their head down and you can tell they're noticeably upset because you're speaking ill about God, that gives a really good example. There's very little that we have to do. We have to be upright, we have to be honest, and we have to be fearless when it comes to defending our Lord, right? Simplicity, holy simplicity. David doesn't just flee that which is bad, but chases it down, grabs it by the throat, and he slays it. Finally, he severs the great threat with its own sword, removing that which is evil from his life. The only thing he keeps is the head, the symbol and the memory of his victory, and a warning of future dangers, and the armor to defend him, which is the symbol of his few found virtues or strengths in the Lord. All right. So we give this little reflection just to give you a bit more to think about, to try to drive the point home a little bit more about the dangers and the things we face in the world. But mostly, when we let some of those dangers in, as I keep saying, that's what creates the worry. That's what creates the anxiety. To be at peace, we're able to just focus through prayer, being united to our Lord, striving for holiness, if we'd actually spend time doing that, more than just kind of the routine. It's good to say your rosary, it's good to say your other prayers, but that time alone with our Lord, the meditation time like we went over yesterday, the striving for greater holiness, really making resolutions and practicing virtue. But the things that corrupt that or get in the way are constantly focusing on the political, the negative, the controversial. It's interesting, even the talks we've given here, immediately after finishing some of these talks, people will come up and immediately want to get into controversy, politics, all this stuff. It's what we think. It's a sign that we too are becoming communist, because the culture is becoming communist. And if we allow ourselves to engage too much in the culture, it will affect us whether we know it or not. One of the things, this actually comes from C.S. Lewis, and I don't like to quote C.S. Lewis. I don't read C.S. Lewis's books, but somebody gave me this quote, and I thought it was fascinating, the quote, because it proved a point. I was speaking to a pastor, and he found it odd that I never quote things, at least he seemed to think this. I never quote anything like from the last 50 years. And I said, well, I have no intention that I don't quote things from the last 50 years, but honestly, I really only do read books from a long time ago when they still looked at books. They used to look at the book, and if the book had an error in it, you weren't allowed to publish it. If it didn't have error in it, they stamped it and said, this is free of error, right? So I tend to read books that are free of error because, well, what do I know? If something goes in there, it's the wrong thing, and I start teaching people and I start saying the wrong thing. Well, C.S. Lewis, you know what he says about it, which I thought was fascinating, this guy. He wasn't even Catholic. What he came up with was, all men fall into the same errors of their own time, except for those men who do not read the books of their time. Interesting. And the pastor who was critical of the fact, he was worried about the fact that I never quote anything from the last 50 years, because it was 50 years ago where they did away with the index. They did away with this need to make sure we only publish things that are without error. That I don't, and I actually do read some books that are, I do quote things. It was just a critical kind of analysis on someone else's part. But after criticizing me for that, he's the one that gave me that quote. And I thought, it doesn't make any sense why you're giving me this quote. It just proves the point, really. So if we engage in the culture too much, if we allow it to take a predominant place in our lives, not just trying to stay abreast at some capacity, at a moderate level. You know, moderation in all things. Moderation is never sinful. Be moderate, unless it's something that's sinful. But things that are good and you do them moderately, they're still good. If they're not affecting you and affecting your prayer, the things I've been talking about the last couple of days, then these are good. But if we engage too much without knowing it, we start to embrace these things. And that's where we too become just like our culture. We have to be careful because our culture is becoming anti-Catholic. And we find Catholics, because we hear it all the time, we friars, we have people come to us all the time and tell us, the church doesn't teach that anymore. The church doesn't believe that anymore. Church doesn't do that anymore. What are you talking about? They told us this about suicide the other day. Well, there's always something new. It's like the more we engage, we start to see people's faith actually is changing. We actually find when we get in conversations with people, we have to be careful what we talk about, because if you talk about normal Catholic things, they're not normal anymore to everybody. They're just not. We're starting to develop different understandings of the faith, even with the clergy and the hierarchy sometimes. We have to be careful in engaging too much in our modern day culture. There's so many errors in it. We have to found ourselves in a true, unadulterated faith. Christ is one. He's the truth of God. He's the Logos. And that truth doesn't change. His church is simply Him on earth. He left the deposit of the faith. That deposit of faith doesn't change. It's that. It's just this. We teach that. We don't need to come up with any new, innovative ways to explain certain things. That's the faith. If we spend our whole life just trying to learn that, think how long it took for us to be able to actually all agree that the Immaculate Virgin was conceived without sin. Not everybody believed that. Now, the majority of the church always believed it, but there were people that still brought it into doubt, and some religious orders still brought it into doubt, to the point of praying all night long the night before the dogmatic pronouncement of the Pope. that the Pope wouldn't make that grave error. Do you see? Crazy, isn't it? I won't even tell you what religious group it was. But it's a true. It actually did happen. So if something like that seems so obvious to us, that the Blessed Virgin was conceived without sin, and the church had always believed it, was something that we only just settled, it takes a while. It takes centuries for us even to sort out what's in that deposit. Why do we have to come up with all kinds of new stuff all the time? Why do we have to have new books that write it new ways and add in new things that we never believed before? See, this is problematic. Stick to the books. Now, there's a huge new movement out there of publishing things that are nice, they're solid. They were all the books before that were 100% approved. Follow these things. Form yourselves well, and as we're formed in that way, we're sure. One of the things I tell the friars is because it's not so, some people aren't able to really do the citing and quotations and all that kind of stuff. Some people are, and that's good. It's good to know who wrote this and where this came from and what papal pronouncement and things like that. But if you're using all books that you know are sure, the information is true, you can trust it, read it. Imbue yourself with all the truths. Let it sink into your heart. It pushes out. That's what spiritual reading is. It starts to push out all the foulness that you've brought in through the contact, out there in the world and things like that, the error, the whatever, the nonsense that goes in. You push all that stuff out, and you fill your soul, as it were, with lots of flowers, right? And it puts off that nice aroma of beauty. And so when you get into conversations, you have beautiful things that come out. Not all the nastiness of the world. We're constantly talking about the nastiness, right? But if you do it in this way, making sure that the books you're using are books that are solid and sure, then you can read freely. Let it go in and speak about it freely. Do you see? If you read things that are questionable, you don't know what effect it's going to have on you. Even people with a good theological background have to be very, very careful.